Henry VI, second part of Henry VI, third part of Henry VI, and then the tragedy of King Richard III. Okay? That's the first tetralogy. Then you get Life and Death of King John, which is not one of the tetralogies at all. Then the tragedy of Richard II, Henry IV, Henry IV again, and then Henry V. That's the second tetralogy. But all of these histories are English history. The only problem is when you read the plays, don't think you're learning English history. Okay? Because Shakespeare is notorious for, as he does with other sources, rearranging things. He moves people around. He changes time around. Okay? For example, in Henry IV, that we'll be starting, you have with your dramatis personae there on page 787. You got King Henry IV, Prince Henry, Prince of Wales. He's also called Harry or Hal. Okay? You got Prince John of Lancaster, Earl of Westmoreland, and Sir Walter Blunt. And then you have the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, and you have Harry Percy, Hotspur, his son. Well, in reality, Harry Percy, or Hotspur, was not the same age as Henry IV. Harry Percy Hotspur was the same age as King Henry. Okay? Prince Henry's father. And Shakespeare does a variety of other things. For example, he condenses overall about a 20-year time span to about 2 weeks. Right? He moves some people around, he takes some people out, he adds some things in. The sources for Henry IV, and we'll talk about Holinshed's Chronicles a little bit later, not as much today. Or Holinshead, depending on how you pronounce it. Chronicle of England, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, or England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. It's in your introduction. And then Samuel Daniels' book on the Civil Wars. Okay? Shakespeare uses those two sources for both tetralogies. Again, he takes material out, modifies it, etc. He does the same thing with even kind of more recent history, like Richard III. All right, Henry IV. How many of you have read this play before? Anybody? Has anybody seen it? Okay. You got to understand the background here, both the historical and the background in the play. Henry IV, who's now been ruling a while, is in the play Richard II, which is the one that precedes us, as a character named Henry Bolingbroke, okay, who was essentially exiled by Richard II. And in the play Richard II, we see Henry come back from exile. He claims his ancestral lands, which are large, very large, okay? And pretty much an army comes up behind him, supporting him. And Richard II is deposed. This happened really in history. And Richard II dies while in, let's say, custody. All indications are that he did not die a natural death, that he was made dead, in other words, okay? And Henry claims the throne, claims the crown, and is made king, Henry IV. So, at the end of Richard II, Henry becomes king, and so in Henry IV, it opens with he's already king. The problem is, the people are now somewhat restless. They're not totally happy with how things are going in England at the time. Now, my major professor, when I was working on my doctorate, who began teaching right around 1970 or so, he used to talk about how, and because he was pretty far on the left political spectrum, he used to always talk about how Henry IV, the character, was read in the early to mid 1970s as Richard Nixon. In other words, not very well loved. Okay? But also Nixonian in the sense of being a, for lack of a better phrase, a Machiavellian. In other words, he had read his Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. How many of you have read The Prince? Anybody? What does Machiavelli essentially say about the prince? What is better, to be loved or to be feared? To be feared. It's better to be feared. Doesn't mean you have to be hated, okay? But it means you have to instill at least some fear in the people you are ruling over, okay? So that kind of sets the background. So the play opens, and the king gets the opening good lines. Now, I saw this several years ago, not at the Globe, unfortunately. I saw it at the National Theatre in London. And, in fact, I saw both this and part 2. And the actor playing the king, I can never remember his name, is the guy who plays Argus Filch in the Harry Potter films. So if you know who that is, picture him as Argus Filch, scraggly beard, kind of stringy hair, looks like he needs a bath, etc. But make him a king. He is fantastic. I mean, the guy, he's underutilized. As most of the actors, well, except for, the 3 who aren't any good, in the Harry Potter films. Michael Gambon, the guy who played Dumbledore in the latter films, after, what's his name, unfortunately died, plays Falstaff. Nails it. And I was sitting, one of my seats, I was front row. So, let's say Paul is on the stage. I am right about here. And Gambon playing Falstaff is walking around, acting like Falstaff, doing all kinds of stuff. And, going off at the top of his voice, spittle flying everywhere, and first, second, third, fourth, fifth rows, etc. Okay? So the play opens. So shaken as we are, so wan with care, find we a time for frighted peace to pant, and breathe short-winded accents of new broils, to be commenced in strands afar remote. In other words, it's like we've just gotten over one emergency, and now we have new problems arising elsewhere in strands far remote, means on foreign beaches. He's talking about in France. No more the thirsty entrance of this soil shall daub her lips with her own children's blood. The Civil War, he's saying, has come to an end. There will be no more warring among the English on English soil. No more shall trenching war channel her fields, nor bruise her flowerets with the armored hoofs of hostile paces. Those opposed eyes, which like the meteors of a troubled heaven, shall what? All of one nature, of one substance bred, did lately meet in the intestines shock, in furious close of civil butchery, shall now in mutual, well-beseeming ranks march all one way, and be no more opposed against acquaintance, kindred, and allies. You have to understand the background context. What was the cause of that civil butchery? Henry.
Yeah, his speech.
Yeah, he brought it about. He's the one who took the throne from the previous king. The previous king did not die a natural death. He didn't die sitting there in Westminster. He was deposed, taken captive, hauled off towards Wales, and died in, if I remember correctly, Gloucester Cathedral. We're very close to it, because I always take my students to Gloucester Cathedral when we go. So he says, the edge of war, like an ill-sheathed knife, no more shall cut his master. Therefore, friends, as far as to the sepulchre of Christ, who soldier now, under whose blessed cross we are impressed and engaged to fight, crusades, that's what he's talking about, engaged to fight, forthwith the power of English shall we levy, whose arms were molded in their mother's womb, to chase these pagans in those holy fields over whose acres walked those blessed feet, which 1400 years ago were nailed for our advantage on the bitter cross. But this our purpose now is 12-month old. In other words, he's been king for at least a year. He's been raising an army. He's been intending for 12 months to set off for the Crusades. So, therefore we meet not now. Then let me hear of you, my gentle cousin Westmoreland, what yesternight our council did decree in forwarding this dear expedience. What is the war council planned in preparation for this battle? He says, my liege, this haste was in hot question. I'm going to try not to do the whole play, but I want to set up the beginning. But yesternight, when all athwart there came a post from Wales, loaden with heavy news, whose worst was that the noble Mortimer, leading the men of Herefordshire to fight against the irregular and wild Glendower, not Glendower, Glendower, was by the rude hands of that Welshman taken, 1,000 of his people butchered, upon whose dead corpse there was such misuse, such beastly, shameless transformation by those Welshmen done as may not be without much shame, retold or spoken of. Henry IV sets the action up. He wants to send an army off to fight the pagans, meaning the Muslims, in the Holy Lands. Okay? But Westmoreland tells him that the Earl of Herefordshire, Lord Mortimer, leading a battle against the Welsh forces. How long have the English been fighting the Welsh? Ever since the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes invaded England in 450 AD. Okay? The English and the Welsh generally hate each other. In fact, even the very name Welsh is an offensive term to the people who live in the land that is called Wales, which itself is an offensive term because it means foreigner, exile. They call themselves the Cymry, or I can never remember this, or the Cymru, and they live in Cymru. It's Cymru, and they live in Cymru, okay? Which, if I remember correctly, essentially means us. The name means us. Everybody else is them, okay? So what's happened? The Welsh have attacked. A new battle has opened. So much for the Crusades. The king. It seems then that the tidings of this broil break off our business for the Holy Land. This match with other did, my gracious lord. In other words, it's not only the Welsh you have to worry about. It's another age-old problem in England. For more and even unwelcome news come from the north, and thus it did import, on Holy Rood Day, the gallant Hotspur, their young Harry Percy and brave Archibald, that ever valiant and approved Scot, at home did met where they did spend a sad and bloody hour, as by discharge of their artillery in shape of likelihood the news was told, for he that brought them in the very heat and pride of their contention did take horse, uncertain of the issue. Okay? Harry Hotspur, son of the Duke of Northumberland, which is the northernmost province of England, goes to battle against Archibald the Scot. If there's anybody that hates the English more than the Welsh, it's the Scots. You need proof of this. Watch or read Scottish news, for example, during World Cup soccer. They cheer on anybody who's playing against the English. Even though they're all part of the United Kingdom, they ain't united. In fact, Scotland's probably going to break free within the next couple of years, and then Wales after that. The whole Act of Union will be totally dismantled. So, he now has a war bubbling over in the west and now in the north. England's kind of stuck between that. That can become a pincher movement, okay? So, the king says a few words, and he says, I'm skipping a couple speeches, "Yea, there thou makes me sad, and makes me sin and envy that my lord Northumberland should be the father to so blessed a son." He says, it makes me sin and envy that Northumberland has so blessed a son. A son who is the theme of honor's tongue. Harry Hotspur is the theme of honor. Amongst the grove, the very straightest plant, to his sweet fortune's menu and her pride. While I, by looking on the praise of him, see riot and dishonor stain the brow of my young Harry. Could almost be spoken by Prince Charles. Oh, that it could be proved that some night-tripping fairy, Midsummer Night's Dream, had exchanged in cradle clothes our children where they lay. What has he just said?
Changeling.
Okay, other than changeling. He's saying, I wish Harry Hotspur were my son and Hal were his son. That's kind of hard for a 19 to 22-year-old son to hear from his father. But Harry isn't here. Or Hal, I should say, isn't here for this speech. Okay? Let's stop there and we'll pick up